Good afternoon. I think it's 4 o'clock, so I like to begin. Uh, my name is Izumi Nakayama, and I'm from the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. Today's talk is part of our lecture series for the collaborative research project entitled Making Modernity in East Asia, Technologies of Everyday Life, 19th to 21st Centuries. Our previous lectures, such as those on electric rice makers in South Korea and energy and empire in wartime Japan, are made available online through our YouTube channel. But today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifer Altehenger. Dr. Altehenger is Associate Professor of Chinese History and the Jessica Rawson Fellow in Modern Asian History at the University of Oxford. She is the author of Legal Lessons, Popularizing Law in the People's Republic of China, 1949 to 1989, which was published in 2018 by Harvard University Press. And she's also the co-editor of a forthcoming volume called Material Contradictions in Mao's China with Dr. Denise Ho. She's also currently writing a new book on history of design, industry, and everyday life titled Revolutionary Designs, Furnishing Life in Socialist China. She serves as series co-editors for Modern China publications at Cambridge University Press and others, and serves on editorial boards for several prominent journals. I personally find her work on Chinese design at the Leipzig Industrial Trade Fair, as well as her study on modular design, looking at furniture and life in 1980s China, fascinating, and I'd urge the audience to read these as well. Today, she'll talk to us about engineered wood and how these materials shaped everyday technologies in the People's Republic of China, and what the history of these materials tell us about mass mobilization, industrialization, and socialist governance of the time period. So without taking more time, Dr. Altehenger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I know a couple of people wrote to me saying that they're looking forward to the recording. So I'm glad we can do this because it is a rather ungodly hour in the US. So my talk today, let me start actually by saying thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you to Professor Angela Long, who had the idea at first and contacted me. At first, actually, we were getting to know each other and the work you were doing on this wonderful project. And then you said, why don't you give a talk? And I was delighted at the invitation and the possibility of talking a little bit about some of the stuff I've now been working on for many more years than I'd like to admit. It does take quite a bit of time. Also, thank you, Professor Izumi Nakayama, for chairing my talk today and for taking over the Q&A later on, and Joe Tung for organizing everything and keeping me so wonderfully informed about every step of this process. As some might realize, some people are more comfortable doing Zoom talks than others. I am probably more on the, I look forward to doing this in person again soon, but also acknowledging I'm very happy that this can be shared as a result of Zoom technology, and that this can be made accessible to people who were not at this talk. So just to say this before I get started, if anybody has a question about anything I'm presenting on, but we'll see this as a recording, please do feel free to get in touch, reach out, write me an email. I'll be delighted to hear from you and to talk further about the work I'm presenting here today. So with that, let's get started. Now, the topic of, it would be wonderful if getting started meant that, we move on a PowerPoint as well. So the topic of material modernity, of course, much as this project has been showing is a hot topic, and it is a really, really important topic, especially when it comes to not just bringing East Asia into the picture of global history, but showing just how important East Asia and how pivotal East Asia was at different moments in time, not merely as a recipient, but very much as a source of ideas about the everyday, about technologies, about the making of different technologies. Now, when it comes to material modernity, as in literally the materials, that has been a topic, I think, a fair bit researched when it comes to countries that are not China. So we have wonderful research, I think, on the history of plastics, glass fibers, different kinds of metal, concrete. So this idea that materials is not just about material culture, but it is about the materials that are used to make material culture and about material sciences. That idea, that understanding, I think, is now quite commonplace, and we're slowly seeing more and more publications on this topic, some fascinating research emerging each year. When it comes to the history of China, that is the 20th century, and the history of the People's Republic of China, here too we have some wonderful work, for instance, on natural and artificial textiles, cotton and dacron in the 20th century and the post-war world by Jakob Eifert, Sun Pedong, Antonia Finane. We're starting to see really exciting stuff on glass, and anybody interested in it, I would point you to James Flath's recent article on glass forming machines and glass factories, which was published in Made in China journal recently. We're also seeing work on concrete, and then also on the role, for instance, of brick. Cole Roscom has a chapter in our forthcoming volume, Material Contradictions in Mao's China, which is all about the brick and sort of clay making technologies in the post-49 world. So this is just to name a few, but to say, you know, China is starting, and especially People's Republic of China is starting to become very much a picture of the material history of the 20th century. Now, next to these materials that I've now mentioned, one of the most significant group of materials that shape people's experiences of the modern in the post-war world were, of course, engineered boards, or sometimes they're also called artificial woods. There are a number of different terms for them. Today in Chinese, it's 人造板. I will be using usually sort of engineered boards and engineered woods as a term, but this is sort of all one family. Now, what I'm talking about is this. Plywood, and I've put this all on one slide, which I hope makes this a little bit more accessible. So engineered boards encompass plywood, block board, sometimes also called block ply, particle board, sometimes known, especially I think in the US, known as chipboard, as well as fiberboard. Now, all of these families of engineered boards, of course, have there are different technologies to make them, some of which I will talk about today, but that's sort of, for me, the big four of engineered boards that shaped sort of the mid-century, the mid-20th century and after. What I've given you here is a hope of making clear what these different technologies are, is a set of not just photos of them today, but a set of illustrations from a 1964 volume by Tan Zhongxuan and Luo Wei, who wrote a book called 家居工艺, Furniture Craft. And in that part of that book is all about explaining what are the materials available to furniture makers. Now, plywood here, very obviously, as it is for us today as well, comes in different plies, which essentially means how many levels plywood has and how sturdy it gets as a result. But essentially, it is thin wood sheets, wood veneers that are glued in sort of opposite direction to each other to increase the strength of the board. Block ply takes has this idea of plywood, but it has, as you can see in the illustration at the bottom, it will have sort of a sheet of plywood at the top, a sheet of thin plywood at the bottom, and in the middle, sat in sort of 90 degrees, sort of turned by 90 degrees, you will have a set of glued solid wood. Now, particle board and fiberboard, as we'll see later on in the talk, these are very much the ones I will be focusing on, are made from a mixture of wood or fibrous fiber remnants. In the case of particle board, what you get is usually wood shavings, stronger wood shavings that are glued together, pressed and made into a board that then is surrounded by thinner veneers, whereas a fiberboard is very much a cooked mass, cooked to release its natural glue. That is then, and that comes out as this classic yellowish material that very much looks almost even. Whereas with particle board, chipboard, what you get is you can see the little bits of wood. With fiberboard, it very much looks like a cooked, a sort of a mass of material. Okay, so in the manufacture of everyday goods, these engineered boards were often then used together, and you might know them like that, used together with veneers of all color and all kind. This became more frequent with improved techniques to create more affordable veneers made of wood, of plastic, of artificial leather, etc. So by the 1940s, engineered woods such as plywood and block ply already had a really, really long and also international history. From the 1940s, countries like Germany, Switzerland, and later on the US were then able to produce particle board at industrial level. And later, Japan, Sweden, Germany, and also the US, but especially these first three, became market leaders in fiberboard technology. Now, the trajectories of engineered woods and furniture production were interlinked throughout the 20th century. And this link became especially strong, as I've already said, but I'm repeating this quite a bit for a reason, became especially strong during the mid-century. Now, I've just taken one example here from the UK. In the post-war context of furniture, for instance, first it's the wartime, then it's the post-war context. You can think of something like the utility furniture scheme in the United Kingdom, which started in 1942 and sort of went from this wartime moment of rationing into the early 1950s. It ends in 1952. And it was all about making furniture, mass-producing furniture from materials that were rationed and fairly, resource efficient. And this was then followed by companies, some of which are today famous, that were trying to create equally affordable furniture out of engineered boards with attractive veneers. If you think, for those of you who are mid-century European sort of lovers of mid-century furniture, very often we look to, of course, Denmark and Scandinavian countries, but actually if you look to something like the UK so-called G-plan furniture, that too had this everyday modernist aesthetic with the idea of making, thanks to new fiberboard, thanks to new engineered board technology, making such furniture accessible for the average family. Now, by the 1960s and especially 1970s, this kind of, it was commonly called then modern material, really facilitates the explosion of modular, as we know it today, flat pack, and also inbuilt furniture. So what you're starting to see much more is not the construction of individual furniture items, but really thinking about how to build in and how to maximize space using such new engineered board technology. Now, this was, if you so want, a modern in terms of aesthetics and materiality that transcended ideological divides, but was, of course, claimed as special and distinctive by each. And so what I've put here to the left of my presentation, the two black and white pictures above are pictures from the Soviet Union, where the institutes of design were strongly working with engineered boards. At the bottom, you have a picture from East Germany, the Deutsche Werkstätten in Hellerau, one of the leaders in engineered board furniture technology. This is an image from 1967. And to the right, as a point of comparison, you have IKEA from the 1970s, just to give you a sense of how similar the aesthetics and technologies really are at the time. Now, my paper today looks at these four materials in the case of China, and especially the People's Republic of China. Engineered woods had a remarkable history in 20th century China and in the PRC. And as I hope to show today, the story of these materials and of the institutions and people who made and used them connect. They connect the period of revolution and post-revolution, of socialism and post-socialism, of socialist industrialization, Great Leap Forward utopianism, and post-1978 economic reforms. Now, the title of my talk, Mass Timber, is part argument. Today, the term mass timber is used in construction work, material sciences, and architecture to describe a novel kind of laminated timber that can be used as structural elements in buildings. So there are numerous acronyms for this and different technologies, but mass timber is sort of a word that you can Google it and will really find lots and lots of contemporary discussions in the context also of course, sustainable design. Now here, however, I have chosen a slightly different interpretation of the term. I use mass timber to describe three ways in which I think engineered woods, engineered boards, and the Chinese Communist Party's pursuit of so-called mass work interlinked. The first of these links is in mass production. That is, in terms of the quantity of things that engineered boards were supposed to enable people to make, the availability of engineered board as being more available than solid timber, and the possibility of making things artificially man-made and so. The second way in which I understand mass timber is as mass living, in terms of the way in which these kinds of materials would facilitate a modern, and in this case, socialist modern lifestyle for the entire population. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that's not very different at all from other non-socialist countries that are using exactly the same sort of material to facilitate mass living as well, sort of living for the entire population. And then finally, and I think this is perhaps the bit in which the People's Republic does become quite distinct, mass participation, in terms of trying to involve as many people as possible in the making, not just the use, but also the making of this kind of material. So to give you a bit of an idea of the structure of my talk, I had, I was saying that earlier, I had initially wanted to show lots and lots of examples from all decades starting in the 1950s and going into the late 1980s. And then I realized that I was being far too ambitious and I was probably going to keep you here for the next 3 hours. So instead, I'll confine my talk to 2 time periods, which are still fairly substantial, but I think work well in terms of comparison. So my first bit of my talk will look at the mid-1950s into the early 1960s. That is the context of the first and ill-fated second 5-year plan, the Great Leap Forward and its aftermath. And then I'll move to the mid to late 1970s into the mid-1980s in the context of the late Cultural Revolution and period of reform and opening. Now, both periods saw major efforts to develop new materials that could facilitate mass production, resource management, and the modernization of everyday life. Connecting the two, I think, highlights some of the very interesting links between the kind of material sciences and systems thinking about production that was pursued during the Great Leap Forward and then in the early years of economic reforms. And I think colleagues, including Sigrid Schmalzer, are starting to make these connections. And I think we really do need to think very carefully about how the late 50s really do connect in interesting ways to the late 1970s and early 1980s. Now, I begin my talk in the mid-1950s because the young PRC government during the early 1950s was less concerned about the materials used to make things and more concerned at first about how to organize labor used to make everyday goods. So in terms of management thinking and management of resources, the resource was labor, less so than materials at first. And this is something I am working on in a chapter about standardizing furniture and its users. Now, that is not to say that there was no materials research, of course, on the contrary, but the kind of developments I associated with the term mass timber mostly began in the mid-1950s in several ways. By the mid-1950s, Mao Zedong and party leadership had issued several directives exhorting people to be aware of and mitigate material shortages and use materials carefully and thriftily. In the case of timber, newspapers tried to raise the public's attention for the problem of increasing timber shortage and the need to economize. They wanted to educate people about the connection between revolution, the country's resources, and people's daily lives. Now, in a front page editorial in early December 1956, for example, People's Daily explained that timber felling had proven unable to keep up with the demand. There were problems with stocks, with provisions, and with delivery. And unless solutions were found, the article's author wrote, this was going to affect, quote, the development of our construction enterprises, end quote, and, quote, the fulfillment of people's everyday needs. So construction and everyday needs very clearly are being linked here and everywhere else. More and quicker felling of timber was not an option, readers were told. Too much timber was already being felled. More felling would also be a waste, as existing methods to process logs during manufacturing were often discarding over half of the wood post-production, including branches, barks, and twigs, as well as wood shavings and sawdust, not to mention timber pieces workers discarded when they cut out planks from solid logs. Now, the solution was to economize, strictly reduce consumption of solid timber, reconsider which, quote, waste, quote, materials from timber processing could be used productively, and find other materials to replace timber. One term that came to represent this need to save and use resources carefully at the time was 综合利用, or also translated, I'm translating it as integrated use, inspired really by the work that Sigrid Schmalzer has done. She also has a talk in this series, which I very much encourage people to take a look at. It's called Connecting the Dots. It is fascinating. And she talks about the wider world of 综合利用, calling it a form of material and administrative integration. And I hope what you'll see today really links nicely to show what that looked like in the case of timber. So integrated use in my examples today often express the belief that smart resource management might best be achieved by a way of integrating how and where materials were used and by whom. In the case of forestry and timber manufacturing, the complaint was that too much wood waste was being produced, as I just showed on the example of the People's Daily material, during felling and in the processing of logs. Also, many factories, and this is a classic thing that gets talked about in articles, also many factories were apparently selling off smaller bits of wood as firewood and kindling. So they were trying to make additional money from this material, but they were not thinking about it, or they're criticized for not thinking about it in terms of trying to find ways to reintroduce this material into the industrial cycle. Now, engineered wood seemed perfectly placed to fulfill the party's policy of integrated use in forestry. First, it was argued that all types of engineered boards, plywood, block ply, particle board, and fiberboard, all save timber resources in some way, either because they were made using different cuts of wood that made more use of the logs, so plywood that gets cut with a machine very thinly by turning the log, or because they used shavings and spare materials that resulted from processing logs and cutting wood. That's fiber and particle board. But while all were better than the use of solid wood, particle board and fiberboard seemed particularly promising to promote integrated use of timber, precisely because they were entirely made from materials previously classified as failure, waste materials. So within months, and this is really interesting, you can see this happening very fast. Within months, engineered boards thus became part of the revolutionary narrative. Major industrial and urban centers such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou emerged also as centers of engineered board innovation and sources of good publicity for engineered boards as a material of the present and the future. So major urban timber factories such as the Beijing Timber Factory, Guanghua Timber Factory, published stories about their new engineered board workshops. In 1957, Beijing's timber factories then organized a furniture exhibition in the city's Beihai Park. The point of the exhibition was to show the kind of furniture that could be produced with such new boards. Old, that was heavy, unmovable, wasteful, unpractical furniture was contrasted with new, that was graceful, practical, and frugal furniture. Sometimes this kind of furniture was described as cheap and beautiful. People could try the furniture and leave comments about what they would want new designs to do. So there's this clear mass line moment of, we put the work out that we've done and we want people to tell us whether or not they think it's going to work in their daily life. Much of this publicity and education, I don't have any photo of this, unfortunately. I wish I had, and I would have shared it if I did. Much of this publicity and education about timber resources and their connection to people's lives was, of course, sponsored and coordinated by the Ministry of Forestry and many of its affiliated factories across the country. By 1958, so we're moving very quickly now into the early period of the Great Leap Forward. And by 1958, the Department of Forest Products Industry estimated that the national demand for timber would increase 5 to 6 times as a result of the second five-year plan. So if things were bad already, they were about to become worse. That was the message. And this made the search for techniques to increase the production of engineered boards even more pressing. Now, the ministry then held a series of meetings to collect information about the research different factories across the country had carried out, as they each tried to develop new types and optimize the production of existing types of particle board and fiberboard. In August 1958, the ministry convened a national conference on the integrated use of timber, at which a range of approaches were discussed in the development of engineered boards, quote, became the primary goal of the integrated use of timber. Now, some of the important uses of engineered boards listed were transport and storage boxes, which turns out have quite a history in the POC. It's a really big question, not only what do you make, but how do you transport that which you make to different places? But then also things like the cladding of 4 walls, encasing for radios, and of course, furniture. All of that is sort of the material universe that fiber and particle board are meant to deliver for. A few months later, by November 1958, the focus on engineered boards was further narrowed down, and this is a really interesting move. Fiberboard now became the main goal of the Great Leap Forward plans. And I'll explain in a moment why. The Ministry of Forestry organized the second meeting now in Shanghai. This is only 3 months later, about methods for combining native Tu and foreign Yang to majorly produce fiberboard. And the meeting made clear why fiberboard should become, as first the members of the participants of that conference, and soon after the Ministry of Forestry officially stated, not only one, but the focus of the Great Leap Forward. So in other words, for the Ministry of Forestry, fiberboard was its big Great Leap Forward, was to be its big Great Leap Forward contribution, for 2 reasons. First, it could be made from any fibrous material locally. This could include, but did not have to include, timber waste. So fiberboard is sort of in that timber universe, but it's also something that's promising to move beyond that timber universe, to include, for instance, rice straws, wheat and barley straws, cotton stems, bamboo stems, shaft of water oat shoots, bagasse from making sugar cane, anything out of the processing of sorghum, barley, anything, satin tails and other kinds of grasses, anything that's locally available. So that was the first advantage. And the second advantage, and this is a major point, is that it would potentially not require much or indeed any kind of glue. There was a massive shortage of glue in the late 1950s. So anything that promised not to need glue had to be of major interest to the ministry. Now, it's worth remembering particle board needs an enormous amount of glue in order to keep the wood shavings together. And so here suddenly we have something that promises in its very composition of materials to take out the need for glue. And so for the Shanghai conference, this was what everybody was talking about. We don't need glue. How cool is that? If we can make fiberboards locally without any glue, we're on the road to the socialist future. And this very quickly becomes sort of that becomes that Great Leap Forward message of hype utopia. Also, it turns out later on, it's not very generalizable, and I'll talk about that later, but that was sort of that moment of excitement. Now, the choice of Shanghai was not coincidental. Shanghai #1 timber factory had pioneered new methods to make what had previously seemed a really complicated technology, that is fiberboard, that required advanced machines, into something that you might actually just make locally in your village. Because until then, fiberboard production had faced one major problem. Not only the glue bit, but also you needed a hot press. Because fiberboard can only be produced by cooking the fibrous material and then putting it, when you shape it as a board, it needs to be hot pressed to release all that natural glue within the fibers. And while there was plenty of fibrous material across China, there were far fewer hot presses. So hot presses really were the problem of fiberboard technology. But the Shanghai factory workers claimed that they had found ways to replace the hot press, either through forms of heating the fiber in different ways in multiple stages, or by using a cold press set above what basically is a kang, a kind of sort of hot press through bricks. This meant that fiberboard promised to be locally produced in people's communes, and very quickly there's a link between people's communes and fiberboard in small sort of local grassroots factories and away from major mechanical infrastructure, i.e. that not only could you combine Tu and Yang, you could go completely Tu. So in the language of the time, and I thought I'd share that because I thought that was quite telling and might be of interest to people working on the history of politics and language, conference participants explained that this innovation had achieved 2 goals. It, quote, dispelled superstition and liberated thought. It dispelled the superstition that fiberboard production is technologically difficult, And it liberated thinking in showing that producing fiberboard is not possible without a hot press. Now, following the Lushan conference in summer 1959, the ministry's plan to eventually make more fiberboard was accelerated very fast to focus almost entirely on fiberboard as an imminent, urgent project. Now you see, that's when you really start seeing everybody talk about how fiberboard is going to revolutionize the world, how you can make hundreds of new projects out of fiberboard, how fiberboard is really the only material you might possibly need. And images started to explain what exactly this integrated use of fiberboard then was all about and what the systems thinking behind it was. Here you have an example of an image, one of my favorites, printed in China forestry on the use of timber waste, Feizhai. You have here, it's connected to 5 major industry sectors: gasification, fiber production, hydrolysis, leaching, and dry distillation. And readers learn that these 5 sectors and their work processes can help turn this kind of wood into, viscose, rayon, fiberboard, furniture, farm tools, masts, toys, and even wood glue. Now, 2 exhibitions in late 1959 similarly drove home the increased importance of integrated use of timbers and tried not only to explain, but to materialize integrated use for exhibition visitors, much like already in 1957 on a smaller scale, the Beihai Park exhibition had tried. So in November 1959, there's a major timber exhibition in the capital, which brings together achievements in forestry and timber manufacturing and covers this question of integrated use, showing what you have to the right, a plastics-covered set of furniture made then out of particle board. I think there was also a fiberboard example, but there was no picture of it. Then and this is one of my favorite pictures, I've shown it a lot, but I never quite get over the aesthetic of this building. Then in 1959, there was an exhibition in the Beijing, on the grounds of the Beijing Timber Factory, a so-called integrated wood use exhibition with an entire pavilion to showcase the achievements in engineered board production. So the rotunda is all built out of engineered boards. And then there's several examples of what you can do with this, including an exhibition of, different kinds of furniture made of fiberboard. Now, this exhibition was structured along lines of historical development and craft and industry of Chinese furniture, and it explained furniture as a major type of timber object with huge implications for people's daily life in the Marxist progression of history, from ancient Chinese furniture to Ming furniture and Qing furniture, which were sections that emphasized handicraft and its high value, but not usability. And then the exhibition swiftly moved on from this historical furniture to artificial engineered boards. And the first type of board mentioned was fiberboard, followed by particle wood and plywood. And here you see examples from the Shanghai No. 1 timber factory showing its success in fiberboard manufacturing. There are examples from Guangzhou and Wuhan, plastic-coated furniture, full fiberboard and particle furniture. The entire conference table was made of fiberboard to really show, this is not just a material that we can use together with stuff. This is a material we can use for everything. This was soon called the example of the fiberboard world. Fiberboard, in other words, being marketed as something that could entirely transform material life at every level. Here you see nicely showing where fiberboard can be used, from the home to transport to even propaganda blackboards. The idea was that everybody could make it and help advance material modernity on the road to socialism. And as these exhibitions were taking place, people's communes were setting up hundreds of local fiberboard factories. Counties, districts, and people's communes were instructed to build their own rudimentary small-scale fiberboard factory. Specialist journals and national newspapers circulated formulas for how to make fiberboard locally. And quickly this is celebrated as a fiberboard campaign. I thought I'd bring some examples, visual examples of this fiberboard production campaign. So you'd see on the left, you get these very schematic explanations for how to fairly quickly, this is even more advanced than many other places ended up producing. This was just sort of the one I had available now for photography. To the right, you see two women workers being shown in a commune making a fiberboard and checking the quality of the fiberboard. In other publications, you would then see again examples of fiberboard making to the left. This is in the Tianjin timber factory, and to the right you have examples of combining Tu and Yang fiberboard, including how to make the kind of furniture. This is now painted and varnished furniture on the basis of this kind of fiberboard. And you also see in the picture an example of how to press on this kind of system that is not the kind of specialist hot press you have to the left, but an actually homemade local press. And that's the picture to the top right. Now, by the early 1960s, shortly after the end of the Great Leap Forward, this narrative actually quickly changed. Engineered timber remained important and would throughout the PRC, but native production stories were downplayed. And also, one problem was that much of this fiberboard, it worked for a while, and then it did all the things it wasn't meant to do. It warped, it fell apart, the glue didn't hold. So lots and lots of problems emerged with this kind of fiberboard, and I'm happy to talk about this later on in the Q&A. But at the same time, also internally, reports began to highlight the material, economic, and human cost of the Great Leap Forward's rally for resource maximization. And this substantially damaged the narrative of fiberboard and the integrated use of timber. For many people, the state's quest to maximize the utilization of resources meant they had to compete for these resources, steal or purchase unofficially. Disorderly felling and chopping of local timber was reported as a common occurrence in Neibu Cancao Ziliao. Sichuan, for instance, reported that an investigation of the local Bureau of Forestry had showed that many cadres allowed people to steal riverside woods, which Neibu Cancao explained as an example of decentralism that failed to look out for the national good. Some people sold this wood to obtain some cash, but many used it to make sort of for every day, and also to make, if they could, coffins for family members who had died as a result of the Great Leap and the famine. In Fujian, which was home to a thriving illicit market, people purchased illegally felled wood as wood substitutes both for animal and human consumption. Former wood merchants and forestry skilled workers who were now unemployed organized these black markets and successfully competed with state authorities for resources. Most frequently, the materials which the Ministry of Forestry had once considered waste, such as sawdust, had become essential food substitutes. Canteens, as Zhou Xun records in her oral histories of the Great Leap, added wood dust to flour in order to make steamed buns, a process that gave those who ate the buns painful stomach aches, but was just something very necessary in that moment. So urban factory work to produce engineered woods in the meantime continued. So you have these bifurcated histories about wood, but it did so with a clear return to focusing on larger scale factory production of primarily plywood, block ply, and particle board. Fiberboard is there, but it's taking it's taking a very clear back seat. When fiberboard was concerned, it was mostly research into Swedish, Japanese, West German engineered wood and fiberboard technology as an attempt to understand how better to make it. We see during this time slowly the emergence of industrial norms by the Ministry of Forestry in 1961 and 62, trying to standardize. So once you have plywood, but to the right you have fiberboard. But now increasingly, whereas fiberboard had once been presented as a material that could be used to make everything, it is now a material for interior use, sort of as backing for other kinds of material that you would see to the exterior. Now, quite a bit of fiberboard, actually, I'm still trying to establish what the numbers are, but quite a bit of fiberboard gets produced during this period. Yet, slowly but surely, all the disadvantages of fiberboard that the Great Leap Forward drive had somewhat glossed over are becoming apparent. And so where the Great Leap Forward had mostly spoken about how you could use all resources as part of the integrated use, now the question became more one of cost and of the use of other kinds of resources. So you're seeing different considerations of resource management emerge. These problems are well described in archival reports of the time. For instance, a document written by the Tianjin Company branch of the China Timber Company in June 1964 expressed difficulties in the context of pricing the fiberboard they produced. And they wrote clearly, the fiberboard is a good way to use waste. But the problem is it's not cheap to produce because it was taking quite a bit of energy and heating. So as a result, fiberboard was not actually cheaper than plywood. On the contrary, it was largely the same or more expensive than plywood. And it didn't help that more factories were still producing plywood, and that people generally, as a result of the Great Move, thought that fiberboard was not a material that was necessarily reliable. So this is, as I said, there's lots of wonderful things to say about this moment, but I wanted to compare it now with another moment that really brings fiberboard technology to the forefront, and that is the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. Now, fiberboard, as it is in the 1960s, remains an interior material into the mid-1970s. And you can find it in examples of furniture manuals, which are produced quite prolifically from the 1960s into the 1970s. And here I've given you an example of a manual on everyday furniture making that was published in 1973 and reissued in 1977 by the Beijing Timber Factory, one of the big players in this sector. Here we start to see by the 70s the return of modular and engineered board-driven aesthetic, and furniture manuals, in fact, I think, which were both for making furniture yourself and for local factories as a guide to how to make furniture, or local carpenters. These, I think, when I would read them as an indicator that party policy was returning to an emphasis on the need for more light industrial goods, something that Laurence Coderre has also discussed in her recent book, New Socialist Things. So we really need to look at the early 1970s here, and not just at what happens post-1978. In the case of engineered boards, it was often the same people who had worked on engineered woods and design during the 1950s and 60s who, together with their students, were now placed in charge of thinking once more about the way in which these, again called new materials and design, could material a newly conceived socialist. So it's constantly this question, how do we make the socialist everyday and the socialist modern? And this is sort of yet another stage in doing so. And yet again, modular furniture is coming to the forefront. And you can see this really in that, if you look carefully, the people who are publishing guides in the late 70s are the disciples of people like Luo Wuyi, and Luo Wuyi had been the one in the early 1950s to work with the Beijing timber factory. So there's a clear, it's also the author of that guide from which I showed you the different kinds of board drawings. So there's real personal continuity here. To people involved in material sciences and furniture, that design, therefore, as well as manufacture, the late 1970s thus may have constituted a new period in many ways, especially politically, but it was not a period that necessarily severed links with the past. Rather, it was a period that promised to provide them the space to materialize many of their plans at a much larger level than had previously been possible. Now, the late 1970s, many of you will know this, but for those that do not, was of course a pivotal moment. The late 1970s was a pivotal moment because of the policy of the so-called four modernizations, which was modernization in industry, science, and technology, which included modernization in industry, science, and technology, and which was meant to, and this becomes more prominent during the 1980s, find ways to combine a so-called spiritual and material socialist civilization. And here, questions of furniture, domestic life, interiors, everyday materiality get closely linked to this concept of material civilization, and then these are then closely linked, this kind of everyday life, material life is closely linked to ideas of socialist spiritual civilization, which starts to include, healthy living, of frugality, thriftiness, and an adherence to socialist morality. Now, one of the key sectors to modernize, and many have written about this is a fascinating moment, was light industry. And while light industry had never completely stopped working, it was never a major policy focus during the Mao era. And now the coordination and production of consumer goods such as furniture, food, cosmetics, electrical and white goods, wood and plastic products, bicycle radios, and other items really becomes a major focus of political concern, with major investments in this sector. And furniture is a hot topic. As many of you will know, 1980s is all about getting furniture, especially young couples who wanted to marry. Very often they were the first able to get some new furniture, but then increasingly, as Deborah Davis has shown, towards the 1980s, really everybody's starting to talk about new furniture and how to decorate your home. This was a development that led to a wave of new research institutes, publications, and educational programs, all aimed at design, furniture design, and how to use new materialities, new materials to make possible a technology-based design. Now, furniture research institutes, they're actually called furniture research institutes, get set up across the country. Shanghai is the first in the mid-1970s, so before the official end of the Cultural Revolution. And then these institutes start to become entirely focused on designing, with the help of know-how from abroad, furniture that can be quickly and affordably mass-produced with the use of artificial engineered boards. So you start to see, I hope you can start to see. Oh, is that the one? Yeah. So you start to see pictures, and this is a wonderful picture from a book called 上海制造中的设计 by Shen Yu. I'm not sure. I think Zoom is not doing this very well. Made in Shanghai. Yeah, I don't think it wants to focus on me. Sorry, I'll show it later on. A beautiful edited volume by Professor Shen from the Shanghai China Industrial Design Museum, where I've taken this picture with his permission from. It's one of the first examples of fully engineered board-produced furniture. And you start to see in sort of the late 1970s, early 1980s, prototypes coming out of this kind of furniture, which once more links to our Great Leap Forward moment of thinking about how to fully produce furniture and goods from this kind of material, rather than just using it as an inside backup material. Now, both the 6th and 7th five-year plans provided the necessary political support and funding for a huge growth in the engineered wood industry, and therefore in furniture production as well. And two things happened as a result. Factories increasingly had workable recipes to mass produce these materials. And these recipes very often come from not just abroad, but also from research and development during the Mao period. And they also increasingly had capacity. So new factories are being built, machinery is purchased. I remember talking to somebody in the wood manufacturing industry who told me that by the 1990s, it is very difficult to get plywood machines in Germany because the Chinese are buying them all up. So machinery is being purchased, personnel is being trained, and very quickly production capabilities are increasing. At first, much of this furniture gets produced for export, but increasingly it also becomes available on the domestic market. Now, engineered boards as a type of material and furniture as a prominent everyday good came together in a specific type of furniture soon called modular board style, 板式 furniture. Indeed, modular furniture made out of boards was quickly presented as the material of socialist modernity, and the one best suited to the kind of modular residential housing construction, small space, think 4 to 8 square meters per person, that was beginning at the time. Now, designers working in the light industry sector advocated for this kind of board-style furniture. I'm not going to explain the cartoon, but it hopefully makes sense sort of between individual items of furniture and why board style that you put yourself together is so much more suited for a quiet environment. Now, designers thought it was the ideal marriage between people's needs and the needs of industry and state planning. First, because the base unit of this kind of furniture was not the individual furniture item, as in, say, a cupboard with its individual parts, but rather the individual board from which furniture items could be constructed and fitted to suit the room of their users. It could serve multiple purposes and be tailor-made. Second, having boards as the base unit suited industrial production as well. As one article in Furniture Jiaju magazine, the major national magazine of the time, explained in 1983, modular furniture was a model of the three transformations, which again reminds me of Sigrid Schmalz's point of threes coming up again and again in industrial thinking and systems thinking. Here we have another example, these three transformations, which were standardization of products, of parts and of machinery, and serialization of product norms. Now, actually, just as a background, and I'm happy to talk about this later, to my knowledge, it takes until the late 1970s for furniture standards to be issued by the National Ministry of Light Industry. Until then, everything is handled regionally and locally. Many designers argued that engineered boards, especially fiber boards, and these pictures are also in my article on modeling modular living, just because they are ones from which I have copyright clearance, and also I just love them. So many designers argued that these engineered boards were the kind of material that might facilitate, as I said earlier, a healthy material life. And so just to take an example from a discussion in Home Interior magazines, which featured quite a bit of this question of how can we create healthy spiritual life through healthy material life. To give you the example of 1984, when the magazine Furniture and Life, 家具与生活, which I've spent quite a bit of time looking at, when it celebrated its first full year of publication, congratulatory statements printed at the front of the issue linked this new kind of design, board-style furniture, to the larger socialist project. And so, for instance, the director of the Xi'an Furniture Research Institute wrote that it united engineering and art, influencing people's morals, aesthetic judgment, and way of life, contributing to beautiful interiors and leading people to have a healthier spiritual life. In other words, design, materials, interior, beauty, health, and spiritual life were intimately connected. Now, I can say something later on if you're interested about the context of the spiritual pollution campaign, but this is very much sat in this moment of thinking about how changing everyday practices and norms might, by those who are very critical of influx of Western ideas and materiality, how this might be counteracted. And somehow furniture design sits between two chairs. On the one hand, it's fine and not really criticized for spiritual pollution because it's clearly a kind of material life that is party state promoted. But on the other hand, design is always something sort of within the arts, when it's not technology, but it's within the arts, that is potentially in danger of being somehow overly polluted by Western bourgeois liberal thinking. So in examples and in columns of Furniture and Life, designers try to connect the science of engineered board, of light industry, and furniture design here to a science for everyday life as a way of thinking about how to maximize on people's homes available space while also creating an individual design for each person. And you have that here, thinking about these small spaces and how possibly with these kinds of boards and with a move away from having fixed pieces of furniture, but board, absolutely board as individual unit-based living, you might actually achieve maximization and a happy life. I know, by the way, this looks so similar to what is happening in Hong Kong, in Japan, in other parts of the world, in Singapore. I think there's a really interesting transnational history of this kind of material modernity to be written. There were also other columns, and I have used these again. This is from the publication because I have clearance for it, but just to give you a sense of these pictures as photographs of a column and a competition of the magazine where people sent in their interpretation of board style furniture and what they had done with the design from Furniture and Life. So this is the age of the photo story, of the home photo story quite clearly. And you really see very nicely all these kinds of fiberboard and increasingly also medium density fiberboard, which is now becoming the mainstay of fiberboard technology, being present in the photography of people's every day as a point of pride. Having this kind of furniture and having this kind of furniture that was white, really offsetting from the dark brown varnished furniture of the 1950s into the 1970s, really was quite a material achievement. But it was one that was, and I think that's important at that point, still for many, not for all certainly, but for many, distinctly linked to the socialist project. This is not about departing from socialism. This is about finally living the kind of promised modern life that people had been told about at different instances since the 1940s. So let me come to a conclusion, and I hope I haven't completely overstayed my welcome, and the pictures were entertaining enough. So throughout the second half of the 20th century in China, engineered boards, and especially fiberboard, were the material of the socialist future. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, experiments to bring this socialist future closer and accelerate its arrival meant that fiberboard became the focus not just of making, but of making things locally. And I think that's a really interesting idea, this idea that you could just make this yourself, essentially in the backyard, which I think is a nice sort of a nice comparison also to backyard steel furnaces. It is the same principle. You can just make this yourself. Solid timber, particle board, block ply, and plywood ultimately remained the material of choice during the 1960s, and for many, the one that they would most likely encounter in their daily life. And different kinds of engineered woods thus temporarily connected present and future, though in the end, as many of my conversations with people who experienced the Cultural Revolution then illustrated, it was solid timber, not engineered boards, that was commonly used again during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Solid wood in this way came to symbolize a return, briefly, to a pre-industrial and pre-socialist, as well as sort of pre-socialist in the sense of not quite what we had been promised, sort of presence. So there's a story which I haven't been able to touch on of, on the one hand, you have this whole conversation about engineered boards, and lots of people are getting engineered boards, but there are also many people who are getting furniture made out of solid wood or have no choice but to revert back to making furniture also locally, but this time out of solid wood that a local carpenter or they themselves make. So there are parallel stories here to be told. The 1980s and 1990s became the moment for the rise of a truly global kind of engineered board, which is today nearly omnipresent, and I mentioned beforehand, and it is quite controversial. That is MDF, medium density fiberboard. And another part of this project, I think about how after joining the United Nations in 1971, China is actually involved in working groups to think about fiberboard technology. And that's something I think we don't know much about and really is quite fascinating. Now, in order to understand how MDF, medium density fiberboard, much like plastics, became such a prominent part of everyday life for people in China, and for us today, we live with this stuff all the time. We need to look not only at the import of machinery and know-how during the 1990s from other countries. To do so would suggest it was all Western import-driven modernization during the era of reform and opening. And I hope that what my talk has shown instead is that we can only make sense of the significance of engineered board and especially fiberboard to Chinese politics and the experience of everyday life if we understand it the way many would have in the 1980s, as connecting industrialization promises of the Mao and reform period, even if heavily delayed, and also as something that was more than a simple foreign import. This perspective is important as I think it can help explain why companies such as IKEA, with its flat pack furniture, attained such massive popularity. It was about foreign fashions, to be sure, but these foreign fashions were not anathema to existing Chinese trends at the time. Quite the opposite, in fact. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. This is really a fascinating way to look at not just material culture, but everyday technology, and also to reinterpret the time period and thinking about the connections between the decades. For those of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please write in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to read them out loud to be discussed. While people are writing in their questions, if I may, start out by asking you a question of my own. I actually have tons of questions. I mean, there's so much issues of industrial hygiene and protections and just things that come out when we think about fiberboards, and also the connections with Japan in the 20s and 30s. But actually what I really was interested in is if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between design, spiritual life, and aesthetics, and living a healthy socialist life. This is kind of an interesting sort of theoretical rendering of how to think about fiberboards and wood and furniture in general. So would that be something that you could address perhaps a little bit?
Sure, that's a really good question. And you also reminded me, I'm not sure I've mentioned, because you said Japan, and Japan, of course, looms really large in all of these conversations throughout, already in the 1940s, obviously, and then in the 1950s and after. And just for anybody who's interested and doesn't yet know about the wonderful work of Sarah Teasley, I'd very much, she's the fiberboard guru. She's a design guru, but she's also definitely the fiberboard and plywood guru. And I would very much encourage you to look at the work she's done. It's been absolutely inspirational. In terms of relationship between spiritual life and aesthetics, I think this was really an ongoing conversation, especially in the 1980s. It isn't so much this idea of healthy living as a part of engineer boards isn't much a concern in the 1950s and early 1960s, which I found quite telling to begin with. Because while you do have you obviously have interior design departments, it's not really a conversation as such beyond specialist circles. By the 1980s, you get a concern with how things are built and how they look and what that means for how people live. And people have quite a bit of difficulty trying to separate between two things. One is design and one is decoration. And decoration always sort of seems to be bifurcated. So design, anything that gets called design by designers is assumed to be smart, in the sense that it combines, that it uses materials well, it takes account of the need for things to be long-lasting and usable, and but also comfortable. That's very important during the 1980s. But as the idea of comfort being, and I think this connects again the 50s and 80s, comfort, not in the sense of comfort, but in the sense of thinking about what you need to do to people in order to ensure they're productive and healthy. Comfort in the 1980s, in the 1950s, getting them to sit straight. But sort of similar concerns for the human body and how design might facilitate human health and how things should be built accordingly. And then you have the problem of decoration. And decoration in some conversations is, well, there's good decoration and there's bad decoration. Bad decoration is clutter and stuff that has no inherent value. Good decoration might be a meaningful picture. Usually the good decoration is, to begin with, not a lot. A meaningful picture, something that is that seems in the magazine, something that is DIY made, is also meaningful decoration. If you have taken an object and so you get these conversations about how you can turn bottles into table lamps. If you can take a bottle and turn it into a table lamp, then that is both aesthetically pleasing and useful. So I think that's the intersection at which socialist spiritual life, in terms of frugality and thriftiness and enjoying decoration, but not too much, enjoying having something, enjoying having domesticity in private life, but not too much, still remembering the importance of larger society, still remembering that having too much is suffocating, is potentially not something you can clean. That's where you really see it intersect, I think, at that level of decoration. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean, it's really important to think about the difference between design and decoration, thinking about functionality and the ideology and all that. And so that's really great. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. If there are other...
Could I jump in? Thanks much for this really wonderful talk. And I've just two questions. And you seem to begin your story in the 50s and 60s during the 5-year plan and all that. But I wonder is there any connection between this system furniture, any relation with the pre-49 light industry in China? I'm asking you this because I'm writing a chapter on socialist soy sauce, and there are a lot of things that are similar. For example, you have to be frugal, so you have to save material. You cannot use that much soybean. You have to find substitute, that kind of thing. But that discourse actually existed before 49, but in completely different context. But so I would like to see if there is something similar in your narrative. And then similarly, I would like to know now, after the reform and opening period, now we are in the 21st century. And I wonder if when people look back at the pretty forward period, the socialist period, is there any negative evaluation of what's been what's been happening in the furniture making and all of that. For food, it's a different issue because it's related to health, and there is a lot of public health issues related to when you tweak your soy sauce and so on and so forth. But how about the use of furniture, in your everyday life living?
Can I just check the second question about negative evaluations of what has been happening, negative evaluations of furniture today?
Of this system, of this plywood or this the use of engineered wood in furniture.
Today,
yes.
Okay, good. Then I've got it. Because there's plenty of negative evaluation of the furniture of the 1950s into the 90s. Well, it depends, but quite a bit. And to be fair, a lot of this stuff fell apart and warped and didn't work out. Okay, so on the first question, absolutely. I mean, I restricted this to the PRC, first of all, because that's where sort of the bigger book project is located right now, the chapter I'm writing. But that's not to say that the early 20th century are not important, quite on the contrary. In fact, sort of this plywood very clearly is a kind of engineered board that was very much part of revolutionary and post and Republican modernity, and you'll have conversations about how you can make all these wonderful sort of these chairs out of plywood that we so frequently associate with Republican era aesthetic. You also get, of course, in Margherita Sanasi's article, as well as other people's work, I found really helpful. In terms of thinking about discourses of frugality, you do get people who talk about how much furniture do you actually need, because there's a sense that some, and Elizabeth Lacouture's work, I think, nicely points this out as well, there's a sense that some people go overboard, that they have far too much, that it's an excessive kind of luxury, and this idea, what should a good everyday life of a Republican citizen actually look like? And I think this is a conversation about something I haven't mentioned here, but that does come up in my sources as well, and I think it's a 20th century conversation. What is need? What do people actually need in terms of furniture? What is a basis we need to provide? And this conversation then, of course, goes hand in hand, which I've written about elsewhere. So apologies for sort of putting an enormous amount of information here. This question about how does furniture connect to residential housing construction, as in there are many conversations, and they take a while for anything to get off the ground, but they exist already in the 1950s, and of course before, about what sort of furniture should you build for what sort of residential housing that you imagine, and how do we coordinate it? Another example of integrated use conversations, how do we coordinate across different industry sectors, from architecture to light industry to forestry. And I think that very much is a 20th century conversation. What I don't think I found, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is this idea that this kind of board could be made locally. I think that's where really the Maoist moment is quite significant in saying, not boards is good for mass production, but adding that third mass participation perspective to what I've called mass timber. And saying, actually, you can do this yourself. It's just been presented as far too complicated, but if we think about ingenious methods, we can make this ourselves. What I'm still working on, and I'm just not in a position yet to really talk about it in a public talk, is trying to sort out whether and how many of the recipes developed during the late 50s actually make their way into engineered board technology in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because I'm fairly sure this stuff doesn't just disappear, even if local manufacture disappears. There are attempts to collect the knowledge of what sort of local fiber boards were cooked from what sort of materials, what sort of natural glues each of those local materials actually gave off, and how that might be used in eventual industrial manufacturing. And that's what I'm still working on, but it's just a bit early to present that material. On the second question, after 78 into the 20th century, when people look back, I think it's a really bifurcated story, because a lot of people will tell me with great pride of the furniture they received in the 1980s. And but then also there's a story, and that's interesting because the engineered board globally always moves between people loving it for all its useful qualities, and people really hating it, partly exactly for the same qualities. And the book here, I would point out, which I learned a lot from, and I repeatedly point out, but it cannot be pointed out enough, is that there is a book published by Christopher Wilk at the Victoria and Albert Museum called Plywood, A Material History. It's largely focused, as he said himself, on the US and UK, and you know, even just for those two countries, he brings together an enormous amount of information. And it shows very nicely how that same material sort of gets pushed and pulled between being deeply hated and very much loved and admired, because the same kind of aesthetic that's possible in the 1980s in terms of building your furniture in, having this really efficient, often white, board style furniture, I think by the 1990s and 2000s is seen either as being just really outdated, outmoded. You want other kinds of furniture. You want big sofas. You don't want these practical inbuilt sofas anymore. And so fashions change. You suddenly have chandeliers, which in the 1980s you didn't have in the early 90s. And so that fashion is clearly changing. But at the same time, today, you're getting it again. You're getting new fiberboard technology, which is seen as sustainable. So the same conversation, the 20th century conversation about sustainability, is coming back in the form of a East Asian driven conversation about how to use a material, bagasse from sugarcane manufacturing as a fiberboard technology. So many of these conversations, many of these material, they're back. And Xi Jia has written this wonderful article about Song He Liyong, where he already points out the sustainability argument that was present in the Mao era discourse. And in the case of engineered boards, you're seeing this really strongly. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think we have a couple of questions from our audience. The first one, I think, is from, the first two are the same person, and talking about how your talk was based in big cities and wondering about the differences between big cities and smaller county level cities. I think Helen Hsu also asked a similar question, which is the issues of rural-urban differences in the Maoist period, in the availability of materials, production capacities, functionality for everyday living, and aesthetics.
Sorry, it just, my screen briefly got.
Oh, would you like me to read the questions?
No, it's okay. I found them again. Thank you. Okay, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Okay, I'm going to start with Changxue Shu's Shu Changxue's question. I am looking, yeah, so I this story I tell, which is the story sort of I started off with also in my own research on Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin. Although Tianjin, interestingly, at least when it comes to engineered board production, isn't really quite as central as Beijing and Shanghai. There's a lot more local manufacturing and workshops, etc. So I would probably put Tianjin, oddly enough, in the 50s, more sort of mid-level than Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou, which are very clearly top of the notch in terms of research and the work they're doing. I am also looking at not so much county level cities. I've been looking at other kinds of provinces. So I've been looking at Lanzhou, I've been looking at Xi'an. A couple of county level cities have come in through looking at local fiberboard production, especially Tang County, which I didn't talk about, which becomes sort of the model county for local fiberboard production in 1960. And one of the interesting things that emerges, for instance, it's one of my favorite examples, which is why I bring it up again and again, is in the late 50s, there's a big conversation between manufacturers, well, not big, but big in my field, between manufacturers in Lanzhou, where after 49, the party reorganizes timber production and furniture production, and it brings in a lot of people from other provinces, which creates all sorts of tensions, and one of the tensions is that people who had been in Lanzhou beforehand, and Lanzhou is a place of a lot of furniture production locally, say, yeah, that's great. So now we have all these guys coming in from places like Shanghai and elsewhere who all say they know what modern furniture should look like. They kick out all of our techniques, and they bring in all this material, and then we're told that integrated use should make things more durable, but actually the techniques we were using, which were really old and traditional, they were really durable, because our furniture you could use 100 years later, whereas this new furniture that's coming in, yeah, it breaks after a couple of years and needs repairing. So I couldn't touch on this, but there's a clear sense that engineered board might be the material of the future, but it's in the present a very problematic material, potentially, and many resources are diverted into making this kind of engineered board, that where others feel, and to an extent they feel they can express this, especially in the 100 Flowers campaign, where others feel that this is actually the waste of material, not the waste of sawdust, but this is the waste of material and resources. Well, as I said, factories producing engineered wood, you have plywood, block ply. You also have people researching into particle board. That's sort of very much the 1940s story. Sarah Teasley has also talked about, which is very useful, Japanese factories in the 1940s that are doing engineered board research, which are then an important basis for what happens in the PRC afterwards. And this very much reminds me of Koti Hirata's wonderful work about, the continuity between these different governments and these different periodic moments in terms of the kind of industrial knowledge, the know-how, but also the industrial material basis. So I hope that answers the question. Helen Sue, may I ask how the issues of rural-urban differences in the Maoist period in the available of materials, production, capacities, functionality for everyday living, and aesthetics? I'm not sure what the question is. I'm wondering if maybe part of the question was cut off.
I'm not sure if that's, I actually don't know, but I think what the question is really asking is about perhaps the differences, because you're focusing on larger cities at the moment.
Oh, rural-urban differences. Sorry, Professor Hsu. I'm being the one who clearly needs a second cup of coffee. Thank you for explaining. So Jakob Eifert in our forthcoming volume has this wonderful chapter, which I very much encourage everybody to read once it's out, called One Country, Two Material Cultures. And one thing he shows very clearly is that the material culture of rural areas, or of people who had a rural hukou, is very different in many ways from the material culture that people in urban areas had, the material lives they had, and some of the access they might have had. I think the late 50s, early 60s moment briefly turns that on its head, because suddenly it's local materials, the materials that don't have to be shipped to big urban factories, that become the focus of attention, where it is the rural with its easy ability to go out and pick grasses that becomes the focus of this fiberboard future. In terms of production capacities, a lot of furniture is actually produced during this campaign. And this relates to a question later on asked about the kind of research I've been doing. In my ideal world, non-pandemic related, I would have moved on in the last 2 years to doing actually research about the sort of stuff people actually got and what happened with it. And that's where I'm trying to sort out, can I actually get some of this information still? Maybe I had once floated ideas of a questionnaire, and that was for a very different purpose actually, but now I'm thinking maybe I can get questionnaires to do this as well, if there's maybe a system of snowballing them and people are happy to tell me about their material lives. That's the hope, that I might be able to do that in order to exactly find out sort of what are people having, what are they getting in this moment of the late 1950s, if anything. But the majority of people rurally didn't feel they needed a lot of furniture, and that's what Jakob Eifert writes about, that you maybe have a couple of stools. Most people would live on a kang. You had a couple of textiles, maybe a little table, but it's really not a lot. So much of this is ultimately with a view to shipping it into urban areas where residential housing is set up very differently. In terms of aesthetics, I think that's the question I would still have to figure out. Right now, I'm working mostly on visual materials, and I don't think they're very helpful in that regard. But there are probably differences, but not any that at this point I feel I could. Others probably can, and this is probably terribly obvious to others. But for my materials, I don't really have much to say yet about major differences in aesthetics, barring sort of the folk locally produced handicraft and industrial bits of which, where there are then clear differences in aesthetics. I hope this answers it. Was a bit rambling. And then Lee Yong Yan is asking about research methodology. Indeed, I am using archival materials and lots of old publications. In fact, I was a very happy Kung Fu Zi purchaser. And I think people thought, what the hell is she purchasing? Because I have so many local guides. I was looking around here, so many local DIY guides that are just they're not anywhere in libraries, really. And catalogs and local materials. Did you do field work beyond library and archival work? I think I just answered that, the famous, that was the plan, and in came 2020. I mean, I did a fair amount of talking to people informally, and I've got stuff there, but not in terms of an actual oral history project that would have allowed me. I wanted to go to Town County, for instance, exactly because it's that center of fiberboard production, and I never managed to do that. But let's see, maybe things change. And separate question, why did you get interested in these Chinese historical phenomena as a Western researcher? That's a really good question. Well, I think it's because, so as many will have noticed, by the way, I speak English. I am not English. I'm German American. I grew up in Western Germany. And one of the things, as you will see when you go into the literature on the history of design, Western Germany is really, really prominent in that literature on the history of design. Exponentially so for a country of its size. Partly that is, of course, explained not just because West German design was market leading, which it was, and because West German research into materials was a big component, together, with the Swiss and Japan and other places. But also, I think West Germany always had this interesting, this fascinating appeal for researchers because it was the country on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and design there was always with an eye, or often with an eye to, outperforming the other Germany. And so there were all these systemic questions that have now been picked up in books like Paul Betz, for instance, has written a lot on West German design and West and East German design. There's a new and free downloadable by OUP book, Designing One Nation by Katrin Schreiter. Again, sort of on this duality, East-West design. And what stunned me, being someone who tries her best to research China, we'll see where I am in 40 years, was that I had looked at this just out of curiosity, just because I had grown up with these big brands that I was seeing in museums and department stores, and this idea that there's functional furniture. I'd grown up with the Bauhaus in school, and I couldn't find this stuff when I looked at China. And I thought, well, I'm seeing things that are clearly produced in a post-war world on the streets. And yet, when I wanted to look at its history, it was fascinating work that was being done, largely more contemporary, but a little bit of historical work at that time. Now it's different, by Chinese scholars and by scholars in East Asia. But it was as if China barely existed. As in the People's Republic of China barely existed in the history of design. There are a number of reasons for that, but one of them sort of is this classic correlation between stories within China and stories that Western researchers tell about China. This idea that really that hadn't mattered to Maoist thinking, that was just not important, and it becomes important in the 1980s. And I think people like Laurence Coderre and others have happily and very effectively dispelled that myth. And that's just when I got into the materials. It's like, this stuff is there, and it's so fascinating, and it's so rich. It is hopefully something I can contribute to telling the story of.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one last question, and I think Hirata Koji has a question here. Can you see it, or would you like me to read it for you?
I can see it. I'm interested in how much interprovincial transactions existed during the Mao period. If the design and production of these products were decentralized until the reform period, does this mean that each province developed a more or less comprehensive production chain independently from each other, rather than having division of labor between provinces? That's a really good question. In fact, in the case of materials I've looked at in Gansu province, for instance, they speak quite a lot about import of furniture parts, of import of materials for furniture production from, for instance, Henan. So import and export there is at first interprovincial, and then there's a level of import and export that is sort of China and other countries. So this fluctuates. There's no one policy throughout the Mao period. But what seems the dominant form of furniture production, and I'm saying this with some trepidation again because it's not a obvious policy that continues throughout the 50s into the early 70s, is that furniture produced in one province or one city should be consumed and available locally to people of that province or that city. That results in something that in the late 70s a lot of people criticized, namely that some areas have plenty of furniture to spare and some have huge shortages. You also have what Sergei Ushakin has, of course, written about as its storage economies, where at times, as a way of alleviating furniture shortages, local governments purchase furniture from other places, also in other provinces, but then getting that furniture to them becomes a problem of shipment. So there is a lot of conversation about that. And in the 1980s, and again, attempts, as I just said, to try and alleviate shortage through coordinating better regionally and interprovincially and inter-city. By the 1980s, that's one of the first things that gets, sort of in the 1970s already, and then by the 1980s, firmly, that's the policy that is discarded, so that furniture produced in big centers doesn't just go for export and domestic urban consumption, but it can actually be purchased and sold across China. And that is the moment then where you had that a little bit beforehand at different periods, but now you get it at different points in time, but now you get it very strongly, that you're seeing companies starting to advertise in lots of different places and saying they have, specializing into furniture and then starting to advertise across the country. Happy to talk about this more, but it is a really, really interesting question.
Could I just add one quick question for a quick answer? Maybe you have it, and which is related to the last one, and that is, how many of these companies are state companies, and how many of these are non-state companies, and how do you see that? Well, maybe just that. I'll ask the rest in an email to you.
Yes, please do email. I don't have the exact number of how many are, but most certainly the timber companies that most strongly appear in that I've also talked about a lot today, they are state-owned companies. So they are downways, and they are what in fact gets called comprehensive wood manufacturing plants, with everything from physics to chemical labs to these different workshops. But then you have a lot of collectives that make furniture. You have a lot of smaller factories that go into furniture when they realize they can't get enough. And so the picture of who actually produces furniture, not who drives the conversation, but who actually produces furniture, is a lot more varied.
Great. Thank you so much for such an engaging talk and even more engaging question and answer session. I think we've kept you long enough. Thank you for getting up early today and doing this talk, despite
7 was bad.
But we look forward to your future book and the forthcoming volume, and also to hosting you in Hong Kong when travel resumes in hopefully the near future. So I'd like to thank you and all of our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing more about this fascinating insight into furniture, fiberwood, and socialist China. So thank you all. Have a good day.